What's up, everyone? Welcome to the latest edition of Do You Even Read? I'm here with the Prudentialist. No big deal. How's it going?
It's going pretty good. How are you, Dimes?
I'm doing great. Usually Prudentialist gives you a nice, big, fat, juicy intro. I'm meat and potatoes. He gives you like, I'm doing great. I'm doing this and that. Here's Dimes. Here's what he does. I don't do shit. You know what's going on here. We're going to be talking about a book that, believe it or not, might traumatize our listeners more than spinal catastrophism. Can such a thing be believed? Anyway, I had a great. We're going to get in that into a second, but I just want to say welcome to everyone in the chat. We got Richard here saying it begins. I think people are starting to get the vibe of this show. Like they're getting their helmets on for this one. I got messages on the last one like how you really fucked me up with spinal catastrophism. And it gets worse. Does that sound like a fair analysis of what we're going to get into today?
Absolutely. I always enjoy it when chat or when other streams reference what we've already done. And it's just like, yeah, this was a really messed up series of things that those two gentlemen talked about. And I'm like, thank goodness. I am here for that sort of energy of, oh God, what are we doing this time? It's almost as if everyone is that one ginger kid from the Magic School Bus, and it's like, please let it be a normal field trip. And it's like, with this show, no way. You're here to be traumatized psychologically, spiritually, academically, and that's what we're here for.
Can we read some Sam Francis today? Shut up, bitch. We got the first part of, I believe, a two-part series on capitalism and schizophrenia. The first being what we're going to cover today. I don't think I got the heart of the balls in me to do part two, but we're talking about Anti-Oedipus, capitalism and schizophrenia. Now I'm going to pass the ball to you to pronounce these men's names because I don't know how to do it.
Sure. So, it's funny. I just finished recording an episode of Stalin's War, and I had Raging Mandrill interrupting me anytime I mispronounced something Russian or German, and this is what I get for learning Spanish and Greek. But no, we are reading Anti-Oedipus, Capitalism and Schizophrenia, published in English in 1977, originally published in 1972. 5 years to translate this shit. Doesn't surprise me. By Gilles, Deleuze, and Félix Guattari is how I've heard their names pronounced.
And I'm sure a lot of people have heard the phrase Deleuzian. And if you've heard the term Deleuzian before, you need to log off. You need to get out of here. You've probably heard it. Maybe you've used it. No one should know what this is. Real people shouldn't know what this is. I'm a cursed man, so I have to read stuff like this. But we're going to try and spare people the challenge, the curse of having to like read this stuff fully, because we're going to get to this book. There's a lot in here, and we're only most likely going to get to some very broad strokes ideas. But whereas with spinal catastrophism, I'll be contrasting this with spinal catastrophism a lot. With that one, you could have fun with it, even though it uses a lot of $5 words, you might say. You can kind of track where it's going. Whereas I felt with this book, and maybe it's due to the translation, I doubt it, but it was purposefully obtuse. And this is something that people comment on, even people who are really into philosophy. Like if you go on the Deleuze subreddit right now, I bet you're going to see a whole room full of people just saying they don't get it. His fans, they can kind of riff with it, but very few people really understand it. And I was in your chat just today because I was doing the meme, living the meme as it were, where it's the just finish movie, then search up movie ending explained, right? So I'm like, I'm going to start looking up some terms from this book. What are some terms? Desiring machines, body without organs would be one. I'm looking up and saying, does anyone else have the right read on it? What I found was no one knows what any of this stuff means. Like there is not one clear consensus where on the definition of something body without organs. Desiring machines is a bit easier to explain. And we're going to do, I think, a pretty good job here. But what you'll find is most people have never sat down and read this thing. They've read excerpts or they've watched videos of someone else explaining it. And it just seems like one big game of broken telephone. And I think that's why we do this, to actually go to the source and say, like, what is actually going on here? And this is one of the rare instances where, as I was reading it, it was far more complicated than I thought it would be. And I know you have had a more interesting history with this, because you read this when you were fairly young and you read it again recently now. And I thought maybe we could compare the two Prudentialists and your view on what you thought back then versus now.
Yeah, so I have my original copy in front of me with handwritten pen notes in the margins. I read it for the worst reasons possible. It was not assigned reading in college classes at all. But for those who have been a long-time viewer of my channel, you guys will know that I did speech and debate in high school and college. It helped pay for my education, and I was quite good at it to help pay for school. And I had to learn all sorts of theories and things for all the events that I did and stuff to talk about that sort of stuff. So I had to learn about assemblages and postmodernism. So I have a lot of books on Deleuzian stuff. I have a lot by Alain Baideau and metapolitics. So I have my copy with me, and it was really fun to read through the translated version I sent to you, but also the one I have in front of me, which are not the same versions, but it was kind of fun because, I read this book 10 years ago. And so 19-year-old me is reading this, and I've got things in the margin like, there seems to be this hardcore belief that fascism is the original sin of mankind and things like that. So for the introduction to this book, there are two prefaces really. One by Michel Foucault, and another by, I think, like Richard Seams. And Foucault basically says, well, Anti-Oedipus is an ethics book, essentially. And if Michel Foucault is telling you that this is an ethics textbook, you should probably just throw it into the garbage bin or into the fire. But so that gives you any semblance of what we're going to be dealing with today. There you go. But when people say Deleuzian, or when people say like this is schizophrenic, what does that actually mean? And that's a big reason why we wanted to do this series to begin with, is that we wanted to take these texts that people are referencing and building upon to make sense of the world that we say we live in. Why are things schizophrenic? Why is that such a popular thing to say? What does it mean to be Deleuzian? And then you want to do like the Jordan Peterson copy pasta. Explain to me what a body without organs is. Don't dumb it down or I'll fucking kill you. Like, honestly, it was... that's what we're here. Prude read it to be popular among the progressive chicks. Oh, wall gone. Not to be actually, I'm going to just throw out my
well,
username.
That's the bloody thing.
That's the bloody thing. That's the point.
Everybody's trans.
Everybody thinks they're gay.
And no, you think we're joking, but that's
we're not. Like we're joking, but we're not joking. But I mean, Walgon, to be in college as a straight white guy in the Trump era was a great time if you didn't care about morals.
Oh, I got a comment by Sean Shaver here saying, so this book advocates for lowering the age of consent. No, that was Foucault.
That was Foucault. This book more or less advocates for the abolition of the family.
Well, it more or less advocates for the abolition of everything, and that sounds like I'm being too reductive, but just to let you know this, to set this up, to tee this up, the scope of this book, really, when we say it's anti-fascism, that's easy to say. And it touches on fascism in the book, but it goes further by saying almost everything we understand as human interaction and social interaction and all of our organizational values are fascism. Like, fascism is just another name for everything. So there is a way to view this, which is to say that fascism is the most natural human endeavor conceivable. And they would actually agree in that. And they're trying to deconstruct all of that. Now, for this episode of this part, we're not going to get too deep into the schizophrenia part. That's going to be part 2. And this is going to build into that, but we have to establish a lot of foundational concepts first. But just in short, when it talks about schizophrenia, it's basically schizophrenia is the ideal state. Schizophrenia it's not used in a pejorative sense in this book. Schizophrenia is something to be, idolized. So that's kind of where we're coming from. So when you think about, I know he was saying it as a joke, but is he arguing for the age of consent? No, they're saying age doesn't exist. You know what I mean? Like they're trying to like deconstruct everything to the root
Yeah,
of
this
everything.
is the deconstruction of all bonds. And so, also, this is going to, if you noticed at the third part of our spinal catastrophism series, even Thomas Moynihan had to take a pause and be like, listen, we're going to reference some religious themes here, almost as if it's a trigger warning, but it's actually more to call themselves out because they're acknowledging that they exist in a Christianized, European Anglo society that has had Christianity part of its philosophy and its understanding of law and the world for at least 1,000 years. And so when Moynihan's talking about things that are like soteriological, I mean, we're talking about things that are salvific or things that lead to, having saving grace. In this book, that's still very present. They don't really want to mention it, but they are trying to deconstruct the ordered bonds of hierarchy. So, for instance, very early in the book, they talk about how, even in the introduction with Foucault, they say that, Deleuze and Guattari are explicitly framing this as an ethical framework to be de-individuated persons, but to be re-individualized, not in a hierarchy based on bonds or common associations, because they're very much against the idea of anything that might remotely sound blood and soil, but also examining the history of how those relationships, familial, biological, racial, geographic, have these gaps where the mind is fighting itself. And so, I mean, even with respects to family, that families are filled with gaps and transected by breaks that are not familial, like the commune or the Dreyfus affair, religion, atheism, Spanish Civil War, fascism, Stalinism, etc. And they reference a lot of things that took place in 1968, both in France, but also in the United States. And so you're getting this really elaborate kind of explanation of philosophy saying, listen, the last 60 years, had been heavily reliant on Freud. We think that Freud got a lot of things wrong, and we can actually take this deconstruction a lot further by, instead of looking at things on a materialist lens of lack, we're going to even break that down even further into metaphysical, I would almost call it subatomic metaphysics, and as it tries to break down the most basic assumptions we have about society and our mind.
Yeah, when I think of this book, I think of it in thirds, and the entire second third of the book is really arguing against Freud, and I would even say arguing against all psychiatry as we know it, because and Lacan. So there's Freud and Lacan and these other towering figures, especially in leftist circles, and they are trying to go deeper than that, saying, no, you've simplified this too much, or you have, and we'll get into that when we talk about Oedipus, but you've done us all a disservice, and even Marx isn't, Marxist enough for them, although they draw very heavily on Marx. I just want to call attention to a couple of comments here. Stumbling says everything getting in the way of my orgasm is a social construct, and you have no idea how right you are.
So
Like
true.
you're saying that, I don't know, has he read it? It sounds like he's read this book and has summarized it to the perfect distillation. Oh God, Derek dead. You had me at everything is fascism. Yeah, and honestly, having read nearly the entire thing right now, they don't even mention fascism that much. Like Spinal Catastrophism, it'll have these huge sections where it's very obtusely written, but then it kind of clarifies it, because Deleuze and Guattari, they wrote this as a duo, which is an interesting way of writing a book. You don't actually see that often. And one is a theory guy and one is a revolutionary. And you have these two opposing poles that are working on almost through a dialectical approach. They create this one work. I think so. You kind of break from one or the other throughout. Like it seems like every so often it just takes a breath to recontextualize itself and make it real or relate it to something real. And that's one thing just at the outset we'll discuss about this book, that people will say that one of the features and not a bug of this book is that it pulls very liberally from other sources, which is actually, if you think about it, how everyone writes Substacks, right? And I think there was a time
So true.
when this type of writing was very novel. The idea that, okay, I'm going to start with philosophy and I'm going to borrow references from, the newspaper, and borrow references from literature and art and anecdote, just from everything. And I'm going to repurpose them and appropriate them for my own ends. And some might say, well, you're misunderstanding them or appropriating them wrong. And they would say, I don't care. I'm just, this is death of the author. I'm bringing in this whole collage. And you see, if anything, that's the style of Substack as I know it, which is I'm writing Substack. And here's a very serious theory book. I'm bringing Wittgenstein, and I'm bringing in fucking No Country for Old Men, and I'm bringing in Taylor Swift, and I'm making one piece based on that, and it's serious, And so
Substack is always either I'm going to take from a source and then crib on it in a stream of consciousness, or it's going to be a very classic thesis, 3 supporting arguments conclusion.
Oh, we have one super chat here from Gabe Underground.
Thank you, Gabe.
And he says, where does the Skibidi play into this? And again, it might sound like he's joking. I assume he's read it already. I can tell you where Skibidi comes from.
I'm going to tell you right now, Gabe has not read this book. Gabe doesn't read.
Where does Skibidi come into it? Well, have you heard of solar anus? We might get, maybe that's for part 2.
No, we can get into that.
So
the bespoke thing is to sun your balls, but the woke thing is to sun your anus.
Well, the thing is, if I'm understanding this correctly, and this is an important part of the book, as it relates to the psychiatric part of it and the psychological part, they reference this very famous book that I would like to read at some point eventually, and it was on a man named Judge, was it Schraber or Schrader? I think it was Schreber.
Paul Schreber.
Yeah, Paul Schreber. So he's this this man who was schizophrenic and wrote an autobiography describing his schizophrenia. And he was a famous case that was investigated by Freud, one of his famous just one-on-one cases. And his interpretation of schizophrenia is what this book is trying to deconstruct and say that you've got schizophrenia all wrong. But one of the things that he was talking about was, like, how do you describe this? Is something about like the light shining out of his ass. And it mentions this a lot in the first part of the book. It just throws in there like, it's just like light coming out of your ass. Like you'll be reading a paragraph that's into it and then it throws that at the end. I'm like, are you trolling me? Is this book fucking with me?
Well, kind of, but not really.
Do you remember that? Do you remember that whole story, or did I get that right?
Oh, with Schreber? Yeah, no, you got that more or less right. I mean, I can pull it up on the text here, but I mean, desire, it's literally in the first section of desiring production. For every organ machine and energy machine, all the time flows and interruptions, Judge Schreber has sunbeams in his ass, a solar anus, and rest assured that it works. Judge Schreber feels something, produces something, and is capable of explaining the process theoretically. Something is produced, an effect of a machine, not mere metaphor. And I think maybe I know that's like a very crazy way to go out in the way and say, like, that's a great place to start. But for context, Daniel Paul Schreber was a German judge who began psychiatric treatment at the age of 42 in 1844, spent the remaining 27 years of his life in and out of mental institutions. In 1903, at the age of 61, he published his Memoirs of a Nervous Illness, in which Freud used as the basis of his influential 1911 study on paranoia. And you can go look at that if you're so interested. And I kind of now want to read that because my read of Freud is very surface level, and I always just I'm permanently ruined by the EST time zone and its other meanings to maybe not look at it as seriously as I should. But that's what he's talking about. And so I mean, the first chapter is called the Desiring Machines, and this was translated by Mark Seam, Robert Hurley, and Helen Lane. Well-known translators of these guys' work into English, but also that we're going to stop looking at things in a biological process. And rather than looking for it metaphorically, we are going to draw over and say, no, everything is machinic. Everything is technic. Everything is based upon the desire to produce, not because it's out of lack that I must make food. It's not because I am hungry that I do it. I need fuel, rather than looking at this in the way that perhaps a normal person would.
Yeah. When we talk about this thing called desiring machines, it sounds very utilitarian, like just a thing you'd say. But if you look up desiring machines, this is a pretty deep concept. And just to set the stage for that, I just want to return to the introduction just to Foucault, because he summarized it. I think this book needed that introduction by Foucault, because, hey, no fans of Foucault here. However, he actually gave you kind of a 10,000-foot view on what they're talking about. And you can always return to that if you're getting lost in this. But he mentioned something here. Informed by the seemingly abstract notions of multiplicities, flows, arrangements, and connections, the analysis of the relationship of desire to reality and to the capitalist machine yields answers to concrete questions. So when he talks about, when these guys talk about machines or desiring machines, at first, when I read that, the mistake I made was, oh, they're taking a bog standard Marxist approach, an anti-industrialization approach, which says that machines are synthetic. Synthetic equals bad. So, we desiring machines are some kind of symptom of modernity, but it's much deeper than that. And they get into that pretty quickly. Like when they talk about machines, it's just something that performs a function. So in that sense, a machine isn't synthetic. It's not something separate from the real. Reality is all machines. So when you say desiring machines, everything is desiring machines in the sense that it's made of components. Like, for example, when we talk about a desiring machine, like an organ is a machine that desires to do something, and it connects to another desiring machine. It's like, as I was reading it, I was reminded of Schopenhauer's concept of the will.
Yes.
And I think we might have even mentioned this last episode, but the will is, to put this very, very simply, it's just the phenomena of things in the universe doing things. Like the idea of the will of an asteroid in space is just to keep going forward. And the only thing that stops it is when it intersects with the will of something else. And that is the universe. Everything will, in a vacuum, everything will just kind of exist unless it conflicts with gravity, electromagnetism, the wind, whatever it is. So it's just the universe can be seen as conflicting wills. And there's a spectrum of will. So the will could just be simple gravity, or the will could be human intelligence. Human intelligence is just a more highly advanced form of will. It's like a self-conscious will, but it's no different, fundamentally, than an apple falling from a tree. That's how he would say it. So in that sense, we're all desiring the desiring machines that constitute the human entity, because we're just a conglomeration or an aggregation of desiring machines. It's no different than a plant and the desiring machines that occur in photosynthesis. And in that sense, you could even liken this to DNA. When people say like everything organic is DNA, right? Everything is, there's human DNA and plant DNA and animal DNA. It's all the same kind of fucking DNA trying to propagate itself in a multitudinous fashion, but it all comes down to that one singularity. So as they're describing this, I hear echoes of other concepts where it's not completely made up. And if you go into science, if you go into genetics, if you go into quantum mechanics, you still stumble across the same concept of like code. There's codes that are functioning at the base of reality. And we actually don't know what causes those codes. When you talk about the spin on a quark, on these very, very elementary particles, like, well, what is a spin? What causes it to spin? What causes particles to fucking do anything, to blink in and out of existence? There's something there you can't even get behind. Now, some people could say, well, that's the mind of God, that's divine providence. That you could explain it away, but there is something there that even Schopenhauer was trying to but you can call it will too. Maybe it's the will of God, or it's this thing called will. But I see Guattari and Deleuze kind of playing around with that idea with desiring machines as just a thing that wants to do a thing, and studying how those interact. And by the end of the book, he's describing how those are betrayed and confused. Now, I gave you a lot there. Is that about the right path that we're on here?
I would agree, but also that you are building Deleuze and Guattari, not you. I should clarify. Are heavily building.
Don't dox me.
I know, right? He's secretly a French pervert, everyone. I hate to break it to you, but if you're a subscriber to Real Secret Coffee Hours, you already knew this. But no, so I think it's also really important that conceptualization is developed almost as an anti-factual to the discipline of psychoanalysis that had been developed at that point. So they take a lot of what Freud says, they take a lot of what R.D. Laing writes about, along with Wilhelm Reich, and basically say, how do we either answer these questions, or are these guys even right to begin with? So, for instance, they will agree that with R.D. Laing and Wilhelm Reich, that psychological repression or repressed behaviors or repressed desires are consequences of historical and personalized forms of social oppression, which, of course, this is power, this is hierarchy, and to Deleuze and Guattari, this is very much the premise of fascism. And again, if you read the introduction that Foucault lays out, this is where you get to see the logical conclusion of these ideas. So, for instance, Deleuze and Guattari pursue the slightest traces of fascism in the body, is what he talks about. And what does he mean, fascism, Foucault? And what does fascism mean to Guattari and Deleuze? Well, it is a thing that is ever present in our minds. It is something that causes us to love power, to love security, to rule over another, and to respect our place in hierarchy. It is the desire to dominate, to oppress, as well as to be part of a system that exploits you. And so, this book sort of outlines, at least per Foucault, and as well as Deleuze and Guattari themselves, that we wish to undermine this question. We want to answer the question that Wilhelm Reich posed in the 30s and 40s, which is, why do the people seek fascism?
Yeah, and that's it. And that's one blinding light of clarity that peeks through in this book, that everything comes back to this Marxist question that's been appearing ever since Marx was alive, right up until now, right up until the Zizeks right now. Like, why do people seem to want fascism? Sometimes they'll even say it in those words, but it's just funny. I was listening to, not to get too political, but with the election of Donald Trump, I'm noticing a lot of leftists. They're basically saying the same thing. Why do people want this? They shouldn't. They can't. All of our data says that they should want to rebel against this, but they don't. So they have to they won't admit that they were wrong. They'll admit that they haven't thought about it deeply enough yet. And then you just dive into the weeds, dive into this labyrinth of theory, which is what this is. I think that's a good way to open up this whole duality of episodes, which is going to be that they're trying to really explain away why people just seem to like fascism. And by fascism, they mean human organization. They mean the family unit. They mean the community. They mean patriarchy. So when they say fascism, they're not even using it as a pejorative, because every form of human societal interaction in a way is fascism or emerges from fascism. And I will give them credit that they hypothesize the ideal state. And I think at the very least, what you can say about this book is they've thought about this problem all the way to the bottom. They've thought about it they're beyond economics in this book. People think Marxist theory is all about economics. No, Marx's mid 20th century even started moving beyond economics, because that couldn't explain why people hate Marxism so much. So they had to be like, well, it's also this, it's also this other superstructure. It's also these much more fundamental ideas. And then so capitalism, and that's the subtitle of the book, Capitalism and Schizophrenia. Capitalism is just one branch of this vast tree of like oppression and exploitation, that to unwork all of that, what they're saying is to unwork all of that, you must become schizophrenic. And that's not my reading. That they outright say that repeatedly in this. And they mount as good a defense as I've ever seen on being schizophrenic, which is good, because we're all kind of schizo here. Who doesn't identify as schizophrenic? But I guess to be a schizophrenic is to be a communist. So that presents problems.
Do you mind if I go on a slight tangent about this? Because I was reading this throughout this week, my physical copy, and one of the notes that I had here, and it was like very early on, and it was about how they had basically said that they were unhappy with economic explanations about how fascism came to be. And it's this section about what Wilhelm Reich writes about. So I have a PDF that I will upload to Telegram, and I will also link it to a link in my comment section for this video after the stream. But this is for page 29, and it is, I'll just read it here. Quote, That is why the fundamental problem of political philosophy is still precisely one that Spinoza saw so clearly and that Wilhelm Reich rediscovered. Why do men fight for their servitude as stubbornly as though it were their salvation? How can people reach the point of shouting, more taxes, less bread? As Reich remarks, the astonishing thing is not that some people steal or that some others occasionally go out on strike, but rather all those who are starving do not steal as a regular practice. All those who are exploited are not continually out on strike, and after centuries of exploitation, why do people still tolerate being humiliated and enslaved to such a point that they actually want humiliation and slavery, not for others, but for themselves? Reich, at his most profoundest as a thinker, is when he refuses to accept the ignorance or an illusion on part of the masses as an explanation for fascism and demands an explanation that takes their desires into account. The explanation formulated in terms of desire. No, the masses were not innocent dupes, and under a certain set of conditions, they wanted fascism. And it is this perversion of the desire of the masses that needs to be accounted for. And it's almost as if, because again, this book kind of throws out the material sense of need and want.
By the way, did you have a page number there? Because I can actually put this up on screen.
Page 29 for the PDF that I put up there is what I'm reading from. Mine, it is page 35 in my book. But my notes here is that Deleuze and Guattari are not happy with material or political explanations for fascism. And I simply wrote why. And Deleuze and Guattari will go in to explain as to why. But when you look at fascism under this definition of power, this deep inner serpent that is inside of you from the Garden of Eden, it's always been there, and it wishes to end you and to be a powerful ruler or to exploit other people, you get a strange sense of where the logical conclusion to that is. Well, the family is fascist. Well, the basic tenets of our society is fascistic, and we must do away with that. We must become schizophrenic. We must be reborn in that. And if you're like Eric Voegelin, you might look at that and be like, well, that's Gnosticism. And on one hand, you're correct. But on the other hand, you can understand of the last 10, 15 years of politics. Think the James Lindsays of the world. Think the Dr. Jordan Petersons of the world. Think all of those guys who went about and talked about critical theory and talked about things like the Frankfurt School or, no, that's just postmodernism. Why did they talk about it that way? And, why did Peterson give all these lectures about how awful postmodernism was? Because the root of a lot of these things is based in this shit. And the thing is that I don't think that the right ever came up with a good answer to why these people came to the conclusions that they did. And I think that is 2015 of a talking point, as that sounds like, is 2014 anti-SJW, as that sounds like. I think that a big failing is that we've either taken it for granted that these people believe in this shit and they're crazy, or that, more importantly, I think, is that we've either accepted that that's the basis of their understanding and rather trying to move from it and try to answer it in our own way with our own political formula. We've either tried to adopt it, i.e. people writing things like the based Deleuzian reading like Justin Murphy, or, adopting it for their own and trying to co-opt it for their own needs. And how good that can be, I don't know, because there's a lot of stuff in here that's interesting, but just like with spinal catastrophism, the logical conclusion to a lot of these ideas is the destruction of all social orders that we would associate with being good, true, beautiful, natural, right. And I think that's an important thing to consider in the backdrop of all this discussion.
Absolutely. And with spinal catastrophism, it kind of saves it to the end, the big reveal that the purpose of all intelligent life is to destroy the universe and become anti-life, as it were. This leads with it right at the top. So thank you guys for doing that. But they're like, why don't you want total liberation? What do we mean by liberation? We mean liberation from all of our chains. It can't just be economic. It has to be familial. And I actually have Desiring Production pulled up right here. And this is really the baseline of what we were talking about. And so I can just read a part here. Let me just pull up my notes here.
Yeah.
So it says, just so people get a sense of what they actually say instead of just my summary. Desiring Production is at work everywhere, functioning smoothly at times, and other times in fits and starts. It breathes, it heats, it eats, it shits and fucks. Make a mistake to have ever said the id. And that's what they're against here. They're against Freud's id, ego, and superego, and the id being your baseline desires, right? Freud cast the id as something that was animalistic and anti-civilized, and the turn they enact in this book is to say that, no, that's the id is all that matters. everything is the id. Everything's built on top of the id. Whereas I think Freud would try and liberate people from the id. And I'm not trying to do too friendly an interpretation of Freud, because like you, I haven't read everything about Freud. I just I know what I know from listening to the Spurgs in our spaces. And but they are saying that like the baseline animalistic, it's not even animalistic, it's just fundamental, and almost the ego and superego are what you need an exorcism for. But he continues, everywhere it's machines, real ones, not figurative ones, machines driving other machines, machines being driven by other machines, with all the necessary couplings and connections. An organ machine is plugged into an energy source machine. The one produces a flow that the other interrupts. Everything is a machine. Celestial machines. The stars are rainbows in the sky. Alpine machines, all of them connected to those of the body. And you start to see here a recurring theme in the book. And just like I was saying before about DNA and genetics and the code animating the fundamental particles, they are kind of making an argument that because everything is machines, everything is everything. Now, before I started reading this book, we were talking about it in one of my chats, and I forget who it was. One of our members said that I had a friend who read that in college, and they became transgender as a result.
I think that was our friend Virgil Davis Hunt from the Pamphleteer.
Yes, I bet it was. And I believe them. I bet there's not just a few people who probably read this and took it seriously and read it carefully and came out the other end being trans. And my good friend Last Things, we talked about this when we were on, I was on a stream with him recently, and he recently converted to Catholicism, and he felt his faith was being challenged by some of these ideas. Like, what if you take this seriously? Like, does it ever, threaten your faith? And I'm like, well, not if you read it carefully. There's some people who read it carefully and it just twists them up and they come out the other side a mutant. So there's a real danger to that, I think, especially if you're young and you don't know any better, because people are often beholden to the first thing that sort of crowbars them out of the mainstream consensus. And some people call that red pilling. I don't like that terminology, but if you, the audience, think back to, and I'm sure there's a lot of stories you guys can come up with of the first thing that you read that really awakened you to a new way of thinking and to maybe the heterodox way of viewing the world, and that just kicked you off on that journey. Whatever that first thing was, you're beholden to in some way. It has a special place in your heart. And I think that kicks you off in a very certain direction. For some, it's something like Bronze Age mindset. I've heard that a lot. That was the first book that cast them off into that long horizon, and they'll never really argue against that. And that's like the skeleton of their belief system. And so there's some people out there where this is the book that jailbreaks them from the mainstream delusion, and they have my sympathy. Like, this is like what was that meme going around, the libs who take ayahuasca and it like one shots their ego or something like that, right?
Yeah.
Like, you got people who aren't equipped to handle this that really take it seriously, and it just blows their mind because they don't have the experience, they don't have the curiosity to have looked at other stuff, and this just becomes their whole world. And then I think you do come out the other side really fucked up. Just like girls who read Hegel. Girls should not be reading Hegel. If you're a
Well,
girl,
they don't read Hegel. They read the first 20 pages, then they look up the cliff notes, and they try and spin it as being an e-girl because I'm ditzy and I've read this like strange German philosopher allegedly without any notes, and I'm just like, oh, honey.
What have you ever read a Hegel and you're a slut?
Just,
yep. Okay. Yep. Thank you.
thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, ladies. But you kind of get to an interesting idea in this first paragraph about, and this is something I'm sure we'll get to in a second, the description of machines. Machines produce flows. Everything is about flowing energy. Everything is about interconnectedness. Everything is interconnected. And one of the definitions of a machine is it interrupts a flow, almost like a will intersecting with another will, to bring it back to what we were just talking about. So the human body is a matrix of desiring machines and flows interrupting each other's flows and appropriating those energies. And that's really the model that he's using. And I think that's important to establish, because once you really wrap your head around that, everything else makes sense. And then if you don't understand that, then nothing makes sense. let me just keep going here. He says the machine produces an interruption of the flow only insofar as it is connected to another machine that supposedly produces the flow. And doubtless that this second machine in turn is really an interruption or break, but is such only in relationship to a third machine that ideally, which is to say relatively, produces a continuous infinite flux. For example, the anus machine and the intestine machine and the stomach machine and the mouth machine. So I'm sorry, guys, if you don't like hearing about anuses, this isn't the stream for you. Because by that time you read that, you're only like 15 pages in, and you've heard anus like 3 times. And you could look, I haven't read everything by Wittgenstein, but I bet he doesn't mention anus even once.
Probably not.
So, do you have any thoughts on that? What's your kind of summary of the desiring machine? Did I miss anything there?
Let's see. 19-year-old me had said something. This is so cool. I don't get to do this very often because I don't have that many books I wrote in. No, 19-year-old me. Let's see what a 19-year-old prude wrote. 19-year-old prude wrote. Let's see here. Desiring machines. Just basically biologics just gets replaced with a technical explanation. Everything is mechanic. And more importantly, let's see here later on. The other note I have in this section from 10 years ago says things are not based upon lack. It's not because I am hungry. It is because I need fuel. Everything is infinitely connected to a social machine. And then I wrote that in question marks. So I guess looking at it now, I would kind of say, well, this is just a description of social techniques, that because we are not, no man is an island, and functionally there is truly no isolated man, unless you're talking about like some uncontacted like mountain man individual who's been hiking it. But even then, no one has a lifestyle where they have been raised entirely on their own, because we would functionally die. So I mean, for instance, with this text and with this whole chapter, we have a machine, a complete machine made up of 6 stones in the right hand pocket of my coat, and that serves as the source of the stones. 5 stones in the right hand pocket of my trousers, 5 in the left hand pocket, transmission pockets, and the remaining pocket of my coat receiving the stones have already been handled. And it just talks about going through this distribution, this stone sucking machine, and it says, where in this entire circuit do we find, for instance, like sexual pleasure or release, and trying to make sense of why do we wish to reproduce. And it's, obviously it's because we have this desire to produce life. We have this desire to have release. We have things that are built for a specific purpose. And because of that, everything can then be brought down to a very Marxist sort of lens about production. And this is on page 3. It's right there. He says, what the schizophrenic experience is, both as an individual and as a member of the human species, is not any one specific aspect of nature, but nature as a process of production. What do we mean here by process? It is probable that at a certain level, nature and industry are 2 separate, distinct things from one point of view. Industry is the opposite of nature. From another, industry extracts raw materials from nature, yet another it returns to refuse its refuse to nature, and so on. Even within society, this characteristic man-nature, industry-nature, society-nature relationship is responsible for the distinction of relatively autonomous spheres that are called production, distribution, and consumption. But in general, this entire level of distinctions examined in the point of view and its formal developed structures presupposes, as Marx has demonstrated, not only the existence of capital and division of labor, but also the false consciousness that capitalist being necessarily acquires both of itself and supposedly fixed elements within an overall process. For the real truth of the matter, the glaring sober truth that resides in delirium, is that there is no such thing as a relatively independent sphere of circuits. Production is immediately consumption is a recording process without any sort of mediation. The recording process and the consumption directly determine production. They do so within production process itself. Hence, everything in production is a production of productions, the flow, an action of passions, production of recording processes, the distributions and coordinates that serve as points of reference, productions of consumption, sensual pleasures of anxieties, pain. Everything is production. Since the recording processes are immediately consumed, immediately consummated, and these consumptions are directly produced. This is the first meaning of process that we use as a term, incorporating recording and consumption within production itself, thus making productions all of one of the same process. And now to summarize all that real quickly, real fast, basically, the economic aspects of production, of class, of extraction of resources and built. This is all happening simultaneously. We might look at it as a process, but this all goes into that distinction of what is called, flow for Deleuze and Guattari.
Yeah. What's interesting is as you're saying all that, like people or I think there was a comment back here saying that everything here is framed in a very utilitarian machine way, but it's trying to spiritualize. And this is what I thought of when I first started reading it. I said, okay, like Marx, they're taking everything is going to be contextualized with the Industrial Revolution. I understand that.
Yes.
That's important, but then they're trying to spiritualize the Industrial Revolution. So one could easily say that the universe isn't machines. You could say machines and industry are just an extension of God's providence. You could say that, but what they did was invert that by saying, no, we start with machines and project that back on the universe and say everything is actually mechanical, but it's within that mechanization that we find, the magic, as it were. But it doesn't take much but a flick of the wrist to turn that on its head and say, or if everything is interconnected, you could make this the most traditionalist argument possible. And by traditionalist, I mean going back to Evola, going back to René Guénon, saying like, no, this is something so much more ancient than that, rather than trying to possess and appropriate the ancient world and say, no, this is actually like a clockwork sort of thing, but it's also possessed by a perverted clock. That's what the universe is. And there's another line that, just to be on that same wavelength, from page 27 here. Let me just zoom out here.
Yeah. Well, and while you pull that up though, real quick, I think it's something to look at in this lens is that it's not also. I mean, what they're trying to build off of psychoanalysis and say that the lens of psychoanalysis, which you could spend a whole another hour just talking about what is psychoanalysts, from the very early beginning in the late 19th century tried to accomplish. But, what if we take their ideas and go in the other direction? What if we say that Freud got some things wrong? What if we reject things like sublimation and instead we argue that because actually no, it makes a distinction between desiring machines and social production. Actually, the idea of power is everywhere, and by extension of that, sexuality is everywhere. You can't just say that these are sublimated, and in fact that this dualism is limited and it's trapped in the ideas of Lang and Wilhelm Reich. We actually need to go past that. We need to look beyond that. And so, for instance, when you look at someone like Marx, what is Marx building off of? Marx is building off of Adam Smith and the Wealth of Nations, and he's adding his take on it. He's adding what Smith got wrong in the wake of the Industrial Revolution. What are Deleuze and Guattari doing? Well, they are building off of the world of psychoanalytics, and they're also doing this in the midst of social revolution, liberation movements, and the destruction of fascism as a political order after World War II. And so maybe the things that these guys were writing about was wrong. And we actually need to instead go further into the different direction, because all these things that these guys observed is actually too limited in scope, because they're happening all at once, all at the same time, and we have to critique it. They basically become anti-psychiatry at a certain point.
Yeah, and that's what's the most interesting part, because they come at this from a psychological perspective. So everything is kind of bound up in that reference point. So ironically, if you want to take apart Freud, this is a great book for that. And the limitations of the id, ego, superego, because some people have intuited that that's a very reductive way of looking at that. But I also wanted to just, I'm on page 27 here, read a part that I think also adds a bit more depth to what you're saying about desiring machines. It says, for the real truth of the matter, the glaring, sober truth that resides in delirium is that there's no such thing as relatively independent spheres or circuits. Production is immediately consumption and a recording process without any sort of mediation, and the recording process and consumption directly determine production, though they do so within the production process itself.
Yeah, I was just reading that earlier.
Oh yeah, sorry, I might read that. But so basically saying, just to reframe that, everything is production. So what is a machine within that context? A machine is something that does a process. And so what is a process? Well, now we understand that everything is a process. So again, they're starting with the Marxist critique of production and labor and surplus and everything, but they're actually saying that's all the same, that everything is a production process, including consumption itself, which is an interesting take. And there you start to see them aim their sights right on Marxism itself by saying, no, there actually isn't classes at all, in a sense, right? Like we're moving past class structure. We're moving past hating your landlord. You are a landlord. you
Yeah.
are you are and the landlord is the laborer, and you guys are the machines, and all of it is the exact same thing. And that's again where you're at pre-page 100. And so, like, to understand a lot of the more interesting Marxist thinkers now, or leftist thinkers, they've just kind of moved outside of economics entirely, because I think they failed to comprehend economics and when they had the chance. So they have to say, oh, of course that doesn't matter because we were always fighting a losing game, because to win, we actually have to destroy everything. And so, and I think it goes here on page 33. Let me see. Let me know if you cover this too. He says, the question whether desiring production and social production are really two separate and distinct productions, its one purpose is to point to the fact that the forms of social production, like those of desiring production, involve an ungendered, non-productive attitude, an element of anti-production coupled with the process, a full body that functions as a socius or society. The socius may be the body of the earth, that of the tyrant, or capital. This is the body that Marx is referring to when he says that it is not the product of labor, but rather appears as its natural or divine presupposition. And I just wanted to mention that because we've mentioned Marx. I don't know how many people have actually read Capital. I've read 2 volumes of Capital. I prefer the first one. I haven't really read much else from Marx. And I know, the people who are into Marx, they haven't read it either. So shut the fuck up. Like I'm the only fucking guy out here who's actually read that stuff. But there is one concept that I think was the seed for all this, and there is something about this idea that I can see connects directly to the CCRU writings and to a lot of other ideas. And it was the really, well, it starts with the labor theory of value. I'm not going to go into the entire thing, but just to put it simply, if people don't understand it, so you've got, go back to the ancient world, go back to the realm of tradition, and you had a very different relationship between the laborer and the products of their labor, right? Or the ideal state, we might say. And they deal in very broad strokes when they discuss this, because they need to. They need to have a comic book view of history. But it's like, you produce something, and it's a complete 1-to-1 ratio. There's no exploitation. There's no manipulation. It's a barter system. You get 100% of the value of the labor. And something happens in the Industrial Revolution. Something happens with, and maybe even McLuhan could weigh in on this, but the segmentation of time, the idea of specialization. And this is something that they really get into in this book, about how everything in the past was holistic and homogeneous, and we started segmenting time and segmenting jobs and segmenting classes, and segmentation upon segmentation. So the idea was, just to give an example, a person labors in a factory. And you've got the guy, the boss, the capitalist who owns the factory, and he pays you to work for an hour. You get paid by the hour. 5 shillings is what you're paid. And there was a time when 5 shillings worth of work got you 5 shillings worth of value. But with the advent of automation, technology, you could get more work done in less time. So you could actually, for that 1 5-shilling chunk of time that you're getting paid, you are now producing 20 shillings worth of labor. So you actually pay for yourself within the first bit, and the rest of that hour is surplus. That's basically what a lot of the Marxists believe. So you're creating surplus, not for you. That's for the capitalist. That's who owns the factory. And something interesting happens. The idea of the surplus becomes this free floating entity, almost like the new sphere. So the entire idea of labor now isn't just to produce something, it's to create surplus. and the surplus drives more surplus. Now, the job of the capitalist is I need to get as much surplus as I can for the minimum amount of work possible. And then if you take this to the extreme, because there are people who believe this wasn't just a Bond villain concocted by Marx. This is also Milton Friedman. Milton Friedman, who some people might recognize the name of. You can find videos of him. He is one of the few staunch defenders of not only capitalism, but the extremes of capitalism. You can read Capitalism and Power, is probably the best book for that, or watch any of his lectures. Now, here's the guy who says that the free market can solve every problem. Libertarians used to love this guy. They don't now, but they used to. And he said that money can solve, greed is good. He's the unironic greed is good guy. And he's the guy who says the only purpose of any business, the only purpose of any corporation is not only to produce the best product, but maximize profits and maximize profits as much as possible and fast as possible. In fact, that is the sole function of a business. And you extend that to shareholders. The job of the corporation is to make these shareholders as much money as possible, as fast as possible. And this is where you get, I believe, a valid critique of that model. And remember, these are real people advocating for it, saying that, well, that's incongruent with a time horizon, like maybe making the most money for the next quarter actually hurts your profits in 5 years, 10 years. And he would say that doesn't fucking matter. You need to make the most money for the next quarter right now. So, and that becomes almost its own separate organism. So what you get in this sort of book is the adoption of that model, and a lot of these sort of ideas breaking off and becoming their own organisms, becoming their own entities that you can't necessarily control in like a metaphysical sense. So with Marx, you have like the metaphysical organism of the surplus that's haunting everything. And with this, that organism has evolved and mutated into something really complex. Like this, I don't think you get this book without a highly mutated concept of this free-floating thing called the surplus, which now becomes almost like everything.
Yeah, I think that it's really important to look at this through the lens that they're building off Marx, and they're taking it in their own weird-ass direction. So, for instance, you talk about hierarchy, you talk about specialized forms of labor, the stratification of social classes in the economy. Now, this is later in the book, but it builds off of what we're talking here with respects to desire and production. So, for instance, he talks about a social machine, or the flow, about how society is. He says the social machine is literally a machine irrespective of any metaphor, inasmuch as it exhibits an immobile motor and undertakes a variety of interventions. And this is on page 141. Flows are 84 on the PDF. The flows are set apart. Elements are detached from a chain. Its portions of the tasks are performed and distributed. Coding the flow implies all these operations. This is the social machine's supreme task, inasmuch as apportioning the production corresponds to extractions from the chain, resulting in a residual share of each member, i.e. your wages, your life, your profit, and a global system of desire and destiny that organizes the production of production, the productions of recording, and the productions of consumption. Flows of women and children, flows of herds and seed, sperm flows, flows of shit, menstrual flows. Nothing can escape the coding of this machine. The primitive territorial machine with its immobile motor, the earth, so we're talking about like geography, you're rooted in a land, blood and soil. The primitive territorial machine, its immobile motor, the earth, is already a social machine, a mega machine that codes the flows of production, the flows of the means of production, the producers and consumers. The full body of the goddess earth gathers itself to cultivate the species, the agricultural implements, and the human organs. And again, you know, if you're looking at this through Marx, and they see this as, exploitation, not just about the bourgeoisie screwing over the proletariat, but everything is a form of exploitation, and by extension of that, fascism. Well, how do we escape this? And for you and I, if you're looking at Wilhelm Reich asking, well, why do people desire fascism? You're like, well, the primitive territorial machine of, I don't know, the nation state, of people within a certain geographic boundary or whatnot, is actually a pretty basic, not a half bad idea to work off of. And you see that you want to bring that out of there through explaining away through psychoanalysis, building off Marx, and saying, actually, these guys didn't go far enough, and all things are part of a system that we have to escape.
Yeah, and we have to escape that system because we have to escape all systems, and that really is the thesis of this entire thing, because you can track the logic they're employing as they're saying this. It's like, well, if everything is capitalism. It even says, I was reading another summary of this on a Substack, and he explains it here. He says, production or industry is a human endeavor just as much as it's part and parcel with nature as nature. This statement eloquently places humans, not humans as the center of the universe or top of an arbitrary hierarchy, in harmony with everything. Deleuze and Guattari come full circle with their early example of machines connecting to other machines, which is saying that, okay, everything is capitalism, everything is a prison you need to escape. But what does that even look like? Because that it does involve, as you said, rebelling against not just the church and society, but the family. And I'm trying not to get too deep into that, because we will discuss that more on the second part. This is more about almost the science of desire. And you mentioned lack there. And the lack he's referring to is from Lacan. And you mentioned Lacan as well. And fuck, maybe we talk about that on a future episode. But Lacan is another psychoanalyst. And it's there, I think you get a lot of the perverted stuff, because as I'm reading this book, I can't escape this feeling that at the base of everything that they're talking about, the only important thing really is sex and reproduction. That's like the only pure desire. Everything else, and they outright say this, almost every desire that we know of is actually a product of repression. That, and I guess I'll spoil this now, sort of the Oedipal drive. What is the Oedipal drive? The to kill your father and fuck your mother. You could be listening to us so far and think, okay, what they're building to is that the only way out of this is to fuck your mother. And actually, believe it or not, they're against that. They're against incest, insofar as they say the only reason we have incest is because we live in an oppressive system. And if we weren't doing that, then we wouldn't even have that desire. So you get into this really interesting, like all throughout the book, you get into this zone where you're always stepping back and you're stepping back by saying that, okay, what even is desire? Because can desire really exist in a system that is oppressive as they say? And the answer is no. So most of the things you desire are a result of this nature. And like I was saying there, if we accept that industry, everything humans do is a part of nature, right? You can't escape nature. We can't exist outside nature. We're all interconnected. Then really what you're also rebelling against is nature itself. Like, you are rebelling against the universe, because if you accept their premise here. So it's not even that they're trying to get us back to a pre-industrial or pre-civilizational state. They're not trying to make us into cavemen. It's something even more abstract than that. And they don't get into details what it is, but it's like you have to accept that the entire universe is fascist.
They kind of do in 1,000 Plateaus, but even then, it's these fuzzy concepts of a deterritorialized, constantly reterritorialized individual, where we are de-individuated away from specialization, stratification, blood or soil, and instead constantly trying to escape the systems and assemblages of what would be considered power dynamics. And this is why they also do spend a long time on Freud, but also this sort of Oedipal complex, is they're against that because they find that to just be a form of trying to invest yourself into production and being part of a system in which you yourself become an exploiter as well as the exploited. And I mean, if you continue on from what I was just reading earlier, they talk about with respect to like women, for example. Meyer Fortes makes the passing remark that it's joyous and refreshingly sound. The circulation of women is not the problem. A woman circulates herself. She is not at one's disposal, but the judicial rights governing progeniture are determined for the profit of a specific person, end quote. We see no reason, in fact, for accepting the postulate that underlies the exchangist notions of society.
By the way, do you have a page number for this? I can jump to that.
Yeah, page 84 on the PDF, 142 for the text.
Okay, so
yeah, and so I mean, to build off of that, the notions of the family, right? It's predicated on, well, who profits? Why do we have these laws about your progeny? Which is very funny considering France having paternity laws and tests illegal. But in this respect, it's, you have this text here that is saying, well, these laws are part of the system. Who profits? Qui bono? Well, clearly the man, clearly the father. This exchanges to notion of society. And to continue on here real quick, it says, we see no reason for accepting that postulate that underlies exchange's notions of society. Society is not, first of all, a milieu for exchange, where the essential would be to circulate or to cause to circulate, but rather a socius of inscription, where the essential thing is to mark and be marked. There is circulation only if inscription requires or permits it. The method of primitive territorial machine, in this sense, the collective investment of organs for flows, are coded only to the extent that organs are capable, respectively, of producing and breaking them ourselves encircled and instituted as partial objects, distributed in that socius and attached to it. A mask is such an institution of organs. Initiation societies compose pieces of a body, which are not at the same time sensory organs, anatomical parts, and joints. Prohibitions, see not, speak not, apply to those who in a given state or on a given occasion are deprived of the right to enjoy a collectively invested organ. The mythology sing of organs, partial objects and their relations with a full body that repels or attracts them. Vaginas riveted onto a woman's body, an immense penis shared by men, an independent anus that assigns itself to a body without one, as the Gorma story begins. When the mouth was dead and other parts of the body were consulted, which of them would take charge of the burial? The unities and questions are never found in persons, but in a series that determines connections, disjunctions, and conjunctions of organs. That is fantasies or group fantasies. It is the collective investment of organs that plugs desire into the socius and assembles social production and desiring production onto the whole of the earth. And so everything about production and how these things are assembled together into what constitutes flow builds this society that they really don't like, because that means there's order, there is hierarchy, there is extraction, there's exploitation, there is domination. Even the bare basic tendencies of I must usurp in order to breed is wrong.
Yeah. Also, I want to just call attention to a comment here by Fabian Cartouche. I just thought there's enough thought put into it that call attention says desire equals reflexive pursuit of neurochemical equilibrium. Repression equals calibration of equilibrium to pro-social behavior through metabolism of adversity. I just think that's a nice comment. There's a lot of good comments coming in today. Also here, Hazael, Land described fear as the passionate desire for the same. What else we got here? Said Tree Surgeon, I read some pretty tedious philosophy, but this is still a bit too much for me. And keep in mind, we're trying to summarize this as clearly as we can. And I actually think we're doing a pretty good job. It's not, especially if you're looking for content that's created by fans of Deleuze and Guattari. People just like the idea of getting lost in this. People just think it's a cool vibe. And I think maybe now is the time, if you're willing to get into the body without organs. Do you think we should? Because it's related to the desire machines. What do you think?
Oh, we can. Yeah, let's go for it.
Now, just to set this up, this is just the second part, desiring machines, because we're almost creating a Cartesian space. Because as you're describing all this, you're kind of, there actually are diagrams in this book. Maybe we can pull those up that visually show what they're referring to. But you might have heard the term body without organs before. And we were talking about this just before we went live. If you look up the phrase body without organs on Wikipedia, did you have that open, Prude? I remember you were about to read it before.
I thought it was funny. Just where is it? Body without organs. So we joked at the beginning of the stream about like the old Jordan Peterson copy pasta. Explain Deleuze to me. Don't dumb it down or I'll fucking kill you. If you look up the body without organs article on Wikipedia, the first sentence is that the body without organs, or the BWO, or French corps de sang des organes, or CSO, is a fuzzy concept, in which a fuzzy concept is defined as an idea in which the boundaries of application can vary considerably according to the context or conditions, instead of being fixed once and for all. This means a concept is vague in some way. Yeah, no shit.
Just imagine the transgender individual just sweating, trying to like write
sweating bullets.
The career Wikipedia editor, like, what's the body without words? It's complex. It needs a lot of context.
Yeah,
Um,
imagine being that like Sid Steinhardt tranny and being like, "Oh man."
I also got a super chat here from Son of Haster. I just want to call attention to this. Loving the
Good guy.
series. I think I've tried explaining spines to 5 different friends at this point. No one gets it, and neither do I. To be fair, you have to have a fairly high IQ to explain spines. Um,
And I'll tell you what, Dimes was right. Thomas Moynihan doesn't know how a spine works.
that's just, it sounds like a retarded thing to say for me, and characteristically so, but just your primary criticism of the book, you explained it so well. It's the uncompleted orgasm of thought. I'm just like, yeah, and he doesn't even know what a spine is. And then you think I'm just being pithy, but I do believe that. And also, I just want to get to this before we get into Body Without Organs. I looked it up just to, again, get the right read on Body Without Organs, because I think I understand it. But I was on Reddit r/philosophy, and someone in good faith says, "Can anyone explain Deleuze's Body Without Organs? I've worked quite hard to understand what it is. I've read it and I don't get it." And then it's just 5 replies of typical fucking philosophy sub going, "Well, I can't pretend I've read it, but here's what I think it is." And I'm reading it right now and had to put it down, but here's what I think it's supposed to be. I'm reading one with little knowledge of this concept. The first thing that comes to mind is like you have people just not knowing what it is, but feeling like they can explain what it is. And I think that's partly to blame for why it's so poorly understood. But if anything, I think it relates more acutely to what I was describing before, which is the idea of surplus breaking away from productive labor and becoming its own organism that drives and kind of casts itself over the entire system. Because I'm trying to figure out a way to describe this. There's this idea in the book that they keep returning to, and the translation is roughly something like falls back upon. So it's like you have a desiring machine, which is just the pure essence of existence. You want something, and then it kind of creates a flow, and then it's interrupted. And then at some point, it kind of mutates into its own thing. Like he has this line where like a desiring machine is like doomed to fail or something. Like if left to its own devices, it will engineer its own destruction. And I'm not completely sold on that. Like some of the more important parts, I feel like the book, and maybe they'd get to this in the second book, but I'm still not clear on. So just for people who are closely paying attention to this seriously, we're getting into uncharted waters with this, and I might get some of it wrong, and I might just tie some of this to other things that I've read, but I think you need to, because I don't think this book makes sense if you don't tie it to other things that give it some kind of form. But the body without organs, what is that? It's when he says the thing that falls back upon, it's like you have a desire that kind of creates that mutates into a lack, and then that recontextualizes the entire process. So if we're using the same metaphor as the Marxist production house, the factory, right?
Hmm.
Eventually, as the productive labor creates this entity called the surplus, it then becomes the entire purpose of that thing, even though that wasn't the original purpose. The original purpose was just labor, natural labor. Over time, it became this thing, but then it falls back upon like a veil or like a cape almost. And then later on, it reframes the entire process as this new thing and pretends it was always about that thing. And there's an idea in there that I find really fascinating. And I think this is where this sort of grows into what the CCRU talks about something in the present arriving from the future. The idea that something that is arrived at later can turn around and change the entirety of what it always was. So in the outlook of capitalism casts itself as the whole reason this whole production line exists and always has been, and that's the power of it. So like it redefines itself later. Another way to look at it, and look, I'm just riffing here myself. This is the jazz corner, everybody, but I'm reminded of K lines. And that's an idea that was pioneered by Marvin Minsky in his book Society of Mind. And it kind of deals with this too, because it shows how the mind is created. And he uses children as an example. And if any of you have children, like I do, you can see this in real time. It's fascinating to behold. But you start to see how an infant builds the building blocks of actions and then ties them together. Like you actually do need to learn left foot, left foot, balance, how to pincer grasp. There's a point in your life where you have to learn that as if you were learning mathematics. Eventually, you do master it, and it becomes autonomous. It becomes just something that is into your baseline code. And the entire way you develop your mind is like building blocks. So you tie different functions together in what are called K lines or knowledge lines. So you have all these basic functions in your body. And eventually, to concentrate on more complicated tasks, you need to almost relegate them to autonomous functions. So you have your left foot, right foot, that's just an automatic process that you don't even need to think about. In fact, if you start to think about it, you get all fucked up, you get twisted up. It's difficult to step back down through your cognitive processes and pay attention to like, wait, why am I right-handed? What is left and right-handed? Like you get dizzy, right? But the idea of K lines and things becoming automatic as they become more complicated, this even ties into ideas that you can tie certain thoughts together into K lines that, and if one element of them becomes triggered, the entire thing becomes triggered. And that's sort of what neuroses and fear are. So if you've built a K line, a link of different feelings and actions, and if a K line is triggered by dog barking and then you run, or you see something and then you feel fear, and that fear guides an action. That's kind of what a K line is. And so they are correct that in some sense, our daily functions are based off of automatic functions. At a certain time, they almost become systems of their own that can be manipulated or triggered. And this is how you trigger people, and this is how you kind of trick them. But yeah, so the entire idea of desiring machines is kind of like that. Now, this has been a big preamble to the body without organs. So, did you want to take a stab at this before I do?
Yes, because I actually, you know what? I have a pretty, I think I have a pretty fleshed out opinion or take on how that is this fuzzy concept is meant to be explained. I'll let you go for it first.
So, to me, the body without organs, like I'd said, it's like capital. It is the thing that gives form to everything else. It's something, it's described. Well, okay. He describes it here. I'll just read what he says here. He says, the full body without organs is produced as anti-production. That is to say, it intervenes. Let me just pull it up here, actually, on page 40.
Page 18 on the PDF.
We got two PDFs here because I'm a genius and didn't, we didn't use the same PDF.
Oh, well, never mind. I'll shut up.
But no, I've got two. I've got yours and mine. So I just switched
okay.
over to mine and I have it pulled up here. But it says the full body without organs is produced as anti-production. That is to say, it intervenes with the process as such for the sole purpose of rejecting any attempt to impose on it any sort of triangulation, implying that it was ever produced by parents. So a body without organs, it's like an essence without desiring machines, right? It's like the anti-process. Because if we admit that
it is the form without essence.
Yeah, and it's something that exists outside of us, and we're always bumping against it. We're always trying to impede on it. But to me, that's almost like the idea of surplus. It's something that is created almost as the shadow of production but you can never really achieve it. And it's so powerful that it kind of encapsulates you. Eventually, that's how I understood it. And the body without organs, like it sounds really kooky when you hear about it, because you think oh, like a zombie or something. But you have to understand that what organs are just a substitute for desiring machines. So it is a thing without desiring machines that only exists as a result of desiring machines. And then, but that's sort of the evil, not evil, but it's like a dark shadow that must be overcome. That's how I would describe it. Does that sound correct at all?
I think that the metaphor that they use helps explain this as well. So, I mean, quote, capital is indeed the body without organs of the capitalist, or rather of the capitalist being. But as such, it is not only the fluid and petrified substance of money, for it will give to the sterility of money in the form whereby money produces money, fiat currency. It produces surplus value just as a body without organs reproduces itself. It puts forth shoots, branches out to the farthest corners of the universe. This is where you get the rhizomatic stuff. It makes the machine responsible for producing a relative surplus value while embodying itself in the machine as fixed capital. Machines and agents cling closely to capital, that their very functioning appears to be miraculated by it. Everything seems objectively to be produced by capital as a quasi-cause. As Marx observes, in the beginning, capitalists are necessarily conscious of the opposition between capital and labor and the use of capital as a means of extorting surplus labor, but as a perverted, bewitched world quickly comes into being, as capital increasingly plays a role of responding to the service, it falls back on, I like to think regresses, or, fall back to the rally point of all production. Furnishing or realizing surplus value is what establishes recording rights. And so while they go on to, it's just that a body without organs is going to fall back onto the desiring of production and do it for its own, but it's the opposite of that. And in fact, later on, they frame it as a perfect model of death. You are a body that has been effectively deterritorialized from anything that can anchor you to stratification, to production, to exploitation, or to being exploited. And because you are no longer territorialized in any of those frameworks of capital, of religion, of family, of sex, of desire to produce anything in a capitalist system, you have thereby become dead to that world and dead towards those territories. And you can rhizomatically extend yourself out in a way in which you cannot be really identified as. We see a form, but the essence isn't there because you're not wanting to produce yourself naturally. And so in a way, you sort of become this both a phenomena, like a mindset that is the opposite of what traditionally exists. It's the inversion of the worldly, but at the same time, it is something that exists within the world in which you are trying to almost escape towards. This is why I made the Eric Voegelin Gnosticism reference at the very beginning.
Yeah, could you dive into that a bit more? The Gnosticism reference, just for the folks at home. Obviously, I know
Sure. So
that's
so for people who know the famous, don't immanentize the eschaton. Eric Voegelin's the famous German American philosopher, and it was a well-known Catholic. He was influenced by people like Hans Jonas, Thomas Aquinas, Leo Strauss. So when you talk about, for instance, and he writes about this in Political Religions, but also the new science of politics. But I think his most famous one, of course, is about science, politics, Gnosticism. This is sort of the most famous text about it all. Really, it's about trying to ascertain secret knowledge, to give a really basic, bare bones format of Gnosticism. But what I'm saying here is that you're trying to escape your body, that the world of capital and that the oppressive nature of stratifications and desires means that you exist in a world that is evil and that is always against you, and therefore you must escape it. You must achieve gnosis. And in this instance, you must become rhizome. You must become a body without organs. I mean, it's a very... this is where James Lindsay might just stop there and say see this neo-Marxist Gnostic bullshit. And it's well, there's so much more to this, because they're trying to explain to de-individuate a person and to escape this format of wanting to constantly produce and be part of the flow of recording and processing and creating things. And in order to do so, you have to find a way to be something that's less identifiable, that has kind of an image, but there's nothing really inside that image. There's no form to it. And instead, we kind of just get this vague chalk outline, but we don't know what really is there. And because of that, it allows you to sort of stretch forth and try to de-individuate from specific territories, ideas, politics, religions, family, sex, etc. And it becomes a model of death, as Deleuze and Guattari talk about later. And so you become dead to a world that hates you. You achieve some form of getting out there. And I mean, it's only because I've read Voegelin that I'm making this connection, and I could be totally butchering what Deleuze and Guattari originally want, but this is what we do with our brains, is that we make connections to things that we've previously read.
Well, that's the correct way to engage with this book, because that's the way they engage with other books. This whole piece, as far as I'm concerned, this whole book is an invitation to just play around with their interpretations, their purpose, and even their most vehement fans will say that, oh, they're purposefully vague in this or that area, or they're needlessly abstract. It could just be that they don't know what the fuck they're talking about, or they're just feeling around in the dark on this. But I don't think they're idiots. I do think they're kind of leaving this open to interpretation because the idea is so fucking weird. You can't really get your arms around it, especially if like what we're talking about is deconstructing everything. Another part here about the body without organs, it's been described as an egg. And here's the line. It says, the body without organs is an egg. It is crisscrossed with axes and thresholds, with latitudes and longitudes and geodesic lines, traversed by gradients, making the transitions, the becomings, the destinations of the subject developing along those particular vectors. And there's another part here. He says, the points of, and this is on the page I'm on right now, the points of disjunction on the body without organs form circles that converge on the desiring machines. Then the subject, produced as a residuum along the machine, as an appendix or as a spare part adjacent to the machine, passes through all the degrees of the circle and passes from one circle to another. There is no Nietzsche the self, professor of philology, who suddenly loses his mind and supposedly identifies with all sorts of strange people. Rather, there is the Nietzsche subject who passes through the series of states and who identifies these states as names of history. Every name in history is the subject spreads itself along the entire circumference of the circle, the center of which has been abandoned by the ego. At the center is the desiring machine, the celibate machine of the eternal return. No one has ever been as deeply involved in history as the schizo, or dealt with it in this way. He consumes all of universal history in one fell swoop. And I'm breaking my rule and getting a bit into the schizo here, but we're getting to the point where you can't really avoid mentioning the schizophrenic, because as he is talking about the body without organs and this entire system, we reach the point where we need to talk about the appropriate rebellion or antidote to this entire system. I'm just trying to skip ahead of my notes here. What do you think about all that? Do you have any more notes on the body without organs that could? I'm reading the comments here. I think some people might still be lost.
Well, I'm going to consult with 19-year-old Prude for a second. The notes that I have about body without organs is this that I wrote here. Let's see, 19-year-old me said, the idea of the body without organs feels like the anti-Holy Spirit, wherein you're both everywhere, but you're also part of something that wishes not to be part of it because you're just sort of a free-flowing movement of sorts, which is kind of like a very Jehovah's Witness way of looking at what like the Holy Spirit is sort of just like this energy or this force that gets charged up. And that's what I wrote back then. But with respects to all of the things that you just read, I think that you have to look at the eternal return in time, because later on they'll talk about it and they'll say, if we believe, Judge Schreber's doctrine, attraction and repulsion will produce nervous states that fill up the body without organs to varying degrees, states through which Schreber, the subject, passes, becoming a woman, and many other things as well, following an endless circle of the eternal return. The breasts on the judge's naked torso are neither delirious nor hallucinatory phenomenon. They designate, first of all, a band of intensity, a zone of intensity on his body, without organs. And that's where you talk about like the egg thing. Like there's stuff inside that kind of carry all over the place, but at the same time, it's a form that is across a body that at the same time isn't necessarily defined, delineated areas. Instead, it goes along gradients. And in fact, they describe it later as the fleas along a lion's mane. You can kind of see its outline of a body that it's already existing, but it's just simply the opposite of what that thing is.
I was struck by how literal they sound in this book, that when they describe the body without organs, you could say, oh, that's just very, heady concept. But no, they're like, no, it's like an egg with stuff inside of it and something you can draw. Like they're very literal in this, and they could actually sketch out like an equation or a map of what it is that they're trying to describe. So anyway, I just thought that was
yeah. There's a lot of, I mean, as much as there's a lot of metaphor that gets used to describe this, they do try and concretize it very much. There's not a lot of like or as, so to speak. I mean, while they use it to describe, BWO, they're also trying to pin it down into a formula almost, as if we could actually say per these models, per these theses of psychoanalytics, we can actually point to what we mean here. How, with respects to like children, if you wanted to get into sort of like this Oedipal stuff, you would talk about, well, like children in themselves, they're young. Like what happens to the children who are, engaging with a world of desire and production, and what happens when those things are, left to their own devices, or they're just sort of experiencing the world that they see. And, like, well, if a child becomes like really frustrated, or he's like constantly dealing with the world around him, that might just mean that, a body without organs, the eyes are closed, the ears are stopped up, the nostrils are pinched shut. Everything that is meant to produce is actually the opposite of that. And then children are going to react that way. And in doing so, the repression of what they've undergone through, which are these like forms of therapies, is only going to be anti-production, because the things that you were designed to do are against you. And again, you have this almost you're building off of a lot of the German work there, but I mean, you're kind of building off of, in a very abstract sense, synthesis and antithesis.
This will be a very stupid way of putting it, but this is a very accelerationist friendly book, in the sense that there's nothing you can do within this system. The only thing that makes sense is collapsing this system. And this system is, basically everything. But, it's there's no way to reconcile anything that we are with what their goals are. And I don't know, maybe in the second book they get a bit more pointed about what they recommend, but I do think if you're taking Marxist thought seriously, you do end up with this, which is why I think that this book has resonated with so many artists. Like, this is a popular book. Not a lot of people have read it, but I think they've felt it in the culture. Someone here writes, this is Caravaggio. Anyone who watched Crimes of the Future? Is Cronenberg a Deleuze fan? I wonder. I think that movie was too dark and gross to be Deleuzian, because it looks like a critique on what it is portraying. I think if he was a Deleuzian, he would say, "And this is awesome." You know, you know what I mean? And I don't detect that when I saw the movie. I thought it was more of a, how old is Cronenberg? Would he be Gen X? Because it felt like sort of like a Gen X critique. It's like, yeah, what
Cronenberg is not Gen X at all.
What is he looks old, but I thought maybe he just smokes a lot of cigarettes.
Well, he was born technically silent Gen. He's born in 1943.
Really? He is old as shit. Damn, I thought he was just like a cool cigarette guy. But yeah, so anyway.
I have not seen Crimes of the Future, so I don't know. But now I'm particularly Crimes of the Future is a 2022 science fiction horror film about a performance artist who publicly displays the metamorphosis of his organs in a future where human evolution is accelerated. Oh well, sign me up. I'll watch that. I'll watch that.
It's a pretty uninteresting story told in a very interesting world. You will enjoy watching it, and like the world he portrays, and it is sort of everything looks like it's filmed in a fucking like Cold War Baltic state. Everything's run down. It's in a dystopian future, but has the vibe of like, it feels like you're stepping into something Russian. But the world and the directing and everything is more interesting than the actual story it tells. And I don't want to turn this into a movie corner right now or anything, but I mean, it's good. It's not bad. But anyway, maybe you watch and you get back to me about it. I'm curious if other people agree.
Happily.
Yeah, it is fucking gross. It's one of David Cronenberg's grosser movies. If you like Surgery, this is the movie for you.
I'm good there. I'm good, fam.
Nah, man.
I've been through enough surgery as it is in my life. I'm all right.
Yeah. What if you were a guy who was like really into that? That's how you made your money. That's basically what the movie is. You mentioned lack, and we meant just to bring this back to desiring machines. He's got this part here. He says desire. You might have said this right, but stop me if you did. It says desire is not bolstered by needs, but rather the contrary. Needs are derived from desire. They are counterproducts within the real that the desire produces. Lack is a counter effect of desire. is deposited, distributed, vacuolized within a real that is natural and social. If desire produces, its product is real. If desire is productive, it can be productive only in the real world and can produce only reality. Desire is the set of passive syntheses that engineer partial objects, flows, and bodies. The real is the end product, the result of the passive synthesis of desire as autoproduction. It is rather the subject that is missing in desire, or desire that lacks a fixed subject. Production is never organized on the basis of pre-existing need or lack, which is interesting. Desire is what it is. Desire isn't saying I'm lacking something and so I will produce it. Desire is just a flow. It is that the sense of lack that comes later, the sense of I am missing something, so I must produce. So he's trying to describe a natural state of maybe even like a pre-industrial, pre-modern man, go back to the ancient world where people just are completely lateral. They're just, this is what even McLuhan would talk about back in the true tribal state. Everything is just interconnected and flowing without being stratified anyway. It says it is lack that infiltrates itself, creates empty spaces, and propagates itself in accordance with the organization of an already existing organization of production. The truth of the matter is that social production is purely and simply desire production itself under determinate conditions. So, yeah, what he's trying to say there is that the entire idea of you almost can't be aware of desire. Desire is just what happens. It's only your awareness of desire, which is in a sense the body without organs falling back on itself and making you aware that you are desiring and making you aware that you must lack something. So you must expand the desire, have more desiring machines. And that becomes the runaway mode that just leads inevitably to capitalism. So, but the ideal state would be just uninterrupted flows of desire. So does that sound weird and degenerate to you? I think you can easily draw a straight line to, do what thou wilt be the whole of the law,
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think we have a super chat.
Yeah, I was going to bring that up. And we're restreaming this. So I'm going to do one thing first before I mention it. I would highly encourage you lovely people, if you're interested in actual good commentary and review of not just what we're reading here, but just what the scene is producing, I highly recommend that you go to bloodsatellite.ca, subscribe to our good friend Dimes here and the great work he does with our friend Judas, as well as the Good Suffer store. All the links are in the description, because he does great work. And I am a personal patron for the Real Secret Coffee Hours, where I get to listen to Dimes angrily yell at the TV, which is the Substack world of the right wing online. Highly recommend it. But on top of that, no, Mr. Willie McDuff had just sent like $50, and that's incredibly generous for just simply saying he loves the book streams. Very kind of you, sir. We greatly appreciate it, and thank you very much.
That's $50 US. That's like 120 Canadian. My God.
Yeah, that's why it's so easy to be a patron of all you Canadian people, because it's paying nothing for great content.
Every month he gives me but a pittance. And it rains down on me like royal prestige.
The American dollar's a joke.
I'm just trying to look at the comments here. We got Hazel. Autistic people make good wrestlers since they already know how to scramble. I think that's probably for Geo. That's one of those Geo comments.
Yeah, but that's funny.
We got Willie McDuff. I don't care. I'm just showing support.
Oh, I appreciate it, good sir.
What else we got here? King Salmonfish, gotta give a shout out. Remember to autistically spasm when they do that, so you're hard to grab. I like to show King Salmonfish comments out of order, just to drop them in. I got no idea what he's talking about, but I think to get the full King Salmonfish experience, he's got to yank one of his, 30 comments he's probably made so far.
Yeah.
So I am a King Salmonfish fan. I was on a stream once and he got very mad at me. He cursed me out because I did a little gentle ribbing, and then he put a hex on me, which has not been lifted ever since. So King Salmonfish, rechain your dogs. Look, here's sending bread crusts up to Canada. A lot of people don't understand that the crust is the real jouissance of the pizza. You can tell the quality of a pizza by the crust.
That's very true, and this is why I think that Trump commercial for what was it, Pizza Hut, like 30 years ago, where they eat the pizza backwards. I think that's actually patrician, because if the crust sucks, then you know in one bite that you're in for a shitty time. Because if the crust is cardboard, then I don't want to really eat the good stuff on top of it because it's probably not that great either. I don't know. There's something to that. I think that should come back. That needs to have a comeback.
Now it doesn't take us long to get just completely off track.
Oh, so true, so true. But on the point of lack, though, I mean, this is where so much of the stuff gets boiled down into just Freudian analysis and why Freud is particularly wrong in a lot of ways. Just because lack isn't just based off of, oh well, I desire something because of of lack. It's actually no. Instead, it's more along the lines of, if we look at all these movements that exist. For instance, they do a great job talking about liberation. All these, what Freud talks about, these like litanies of ignorances that of the unconscious. It knows nothing about Oedipus. It knows nothing of parents, gods, the law, lack. Women's liberation movements are correct in saying we're not castrated, so you can so you get fucked. Far from being able to get by with anything like that wretched maneuver where men answer that this itself is proof that women are castrated, or even console women by saying that men are castrated too, all while rejoicing that they are castrated the other way on the side. That is not superimposable. It should be recognized that women's liberation movements contain, in more or less an ambiguous state, what belongs to all requirements of liberation: the force of the unconscious self, the investment by desire of the social field, and the divestment of repressive structures. Nor are we going to say the question is not knowing if women are castrated, but only if the unconscious believes it, since all ambiguity lies there. The belief applied to the unconscious, what does that signify? What is the unconscious desired but anything to believe rather than to produce? What are these operations or artifices that inject the unconscious with beliefs that they are not even irrational but contrary only to reasonable and consistent with the established order? And to just sort of break that all down, Deleuze and Guattari are simply saying, hey, according to our model here, like Freud is missing out on the fact that this unconsciousness model doesn't actually answer for why things do the way that they do. If we think that it's penis envy, or if we think that women are castrated, actually no, it's not what they're saying here. Instead, if anything, it's not getting at the core structure of why are they doing that. It is because they know that they are being oppressed. It's that they think that they're being exploited, and it's not because we're castrated, but it's the simple fact that we know that we are part of a desiring system that has us exploited, and we wish to escape that. And so Deleuze and Guattari are building off of this desire and building off production and building off lack, and saying Freud is wrong and is too sexual, which is funny considering how many times the word anus gets mentioned in this text. But instead, it's so much. I'm not even kidding. Like in the PDF that I have, that word alone is mentioned 35 times. And I'm not even going to get started with the other organs. But but I mean, again, they're simply saying that these earlier forms of psychoanalysis don't consider the actual reasons why we build anything or why we do it. And it's because we wish to be part of a greater assembly, hence assemblages, of systems of production. And women's lib recognizes, hey, we're kind of getting fucked over here. Although they've been wrong, and women have been self-owning themselves for a while now. Look up the paradox of female happiness if you're interested, or just follow Max Danger on Telegram, I guess. But like either which way, you can have fun with that. But they're simply pointing out that actually the Freudian way of looking at this, and alongside Marx, is incomplete, and it is a model that doesn't allow you to actually answer the question as to why people seek liberation.
And let me just, before I answer that, I just want to pay attention here to Vingul. This is a creed-respecting chat. Pearl Jam can get fucked. No argument. Hey, ain't nothing wrong with that. But just to that last one you were making, that's why there's a lot in this book, as shocking as it might be to hear, that I don't disagree with. Like, I actually think with them attacking what many understand as the most popular Freudian analysis, which is that everything comes back to sex, and everything comes back to sex within the family construct. That, oh, if you want to do, that's the joke. Oh, you want to do this, that must mean you want to fuck your dad. You want to fuck your mom. You ever wanted to be in the army? Well, I guess that means you're gay with your dad. That's not far off from what he said. And so they're saying, no, that's stupid, which is a good instinct to follow, and that it's actually much more nuanced and complex than that. But You know what's interesting with a lot of these Marxists, if I am taking their ideas seriously and following them, faithfully and within the context of their own logic, I don't disagree with a lot of it. It's just I refuse to think it's bad. Like, for example, what they're saying is that we create these constructs almost naturalistically because nothing here in this model is actually synthetic. It's not like humans were just recently in a natural state and then capitalism showed up and corrupted us. They are saying that capitalism is natural, fascism is natural, and that it is the destiny of all of these desiring machines to almost work against themselves. It is natural for our desires to create these matrices that imprison themselves. I just think that's good. If we take that at face value, that's good. That means we are always constantly stepping outside of ourselves. We're always, and maybe not all of us. Hey, by the way, let's just say maybe only certain people can do this. Maybe only certain people from certain geographic areas can do this. We don't need to go down that alley, but I think a lot of people know what I'm saying. But let's say if you are always trying to step back and step back and step back and analyze what it is you're doing, and creating these prisons for yourself to constrain this chaotic desire, sure, I'll accept that. But I don't accept that it's bad or something that must be deconstructed. You see what I'm saying? And so I'll actually quite like a lot of this book, but the solution to this is to become a trans schizophrenic. And you know what? I got news for you, pal. I don't want to become a trans schizophrenic. That's not on the menu for my community, right? And I honestly don't think in this book, at least, they did a good job explaining why their solution is superior. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
Like, it just says like, because it's like, why would I will accept that the schizophrenic is the rebellion against all of this, that it is an attempt to return to uninterrupted flows of desire and to step outside of this entire clockwork machine and just not be subject to it. I accept that, but why would I want to do that? Why is that anything anyone should do? Because it sounds like if you read this book fully, it's a great advertisement for fascism.
Yeah, a little bit. You could definitely take it that way. I mean, for instance, when you start getting into the actual Oedipal stuff they talk about, he says, Oedipus depends on this sort of nationalistic, religious, racist sentiment and not the reverse. It is not the father who is projected onto the boss, but the boss who is applied to your father, either in order to tell you, you will not surpass your father, or you will surpass him to find our forefathers. Lacan has demonstrated in a profound way the link between Oedipus and segregation. Not, however, in the sense where segregation would be a consequence of Oedipus, subjacent to the fraternity of brothers once the father is dead. On the contrary, segregation is used as a precondition of Oedipus to the extent that the social field is not reduced to the familial tie except by presupposing an enormous archaism, an incarnation of the race in person or in spirit. Yes, I am one of you. And it's like, huh. Well, way to sell Oedipus to me there, buddy. That sounds pretty interesting. They start talking about, of course, that this isn't a question of ideology. Rather, instead, it's a part of the social desire to produce, and desire is part of that social and technical infrastructure. And this is why they say, and I think this is a great place where we can sort of tease the next episode where Gio joins us, is hence the goal of schizoanalysis, to analyze the specific nature of libidinal investments in the economic and political spheres, and thereby to show how, in the subject who desires can be made to desire its own repression, whence the role of the death instinct in the circuit connecting desire to the social sphere. All this happens not in ideology, but well beneath it. An unconscious investment of a fascist or reactionary type can exist alongside a conscious revolutionary investment. Inversely, it can happen, rarely, that a revolutionary investment on the level of desire coexists with a reactionary investment conforming to a conscious interest. And that last sentence, revolutionary investment on the level of desire coexists with a reactionary investment conforming to a conscious interest. That's why I think a lot of right-wing guys get into this shit right here, is that one little sentence on page 105 in the chapter Psychoanalysis and Familialism, semicolon, the Holy Family. Why? Because there's a lot of people that have some revolutionary ideas on this side of things, but they conform to reactionary investments. That I would like to have the social standings of things that were considered normal prior to the French Revolution, but I would also really like to land on Mars and put up like a blackjack and hooker station there.
Those are all great things. No, that probably is where we need to depart soon, because the next episode I think will add, because you're thinking that, oh, that must have been the entire book. Like, we're really only, I'd say a quarter to a third through
Yeah.
it. And we've touched on some really interesting ideas about how, this isn't just locked within the modern timeline. Like, a lot of this relies on an interpretation of pre-modern man, of ancient man, and hypothesizing how they lived. Sorry, did you read something there?
Yeah, I saw a super chat on Entropy. It's from our friend Sean Schaefer. He says, it seems like the best argument against these ideas is to redact the author, or at least call him a fag.
I think that's how you should start. And that's what, what, if by the end of this, that's the only takeaway, fair. But it's wild. Like, the reason we get into these books is because they have traveled, that they do have resonance with a lot of young people now, even. And for one reason or another, someone had asked earlier in the chat when this was written, I believe it was in the 70s. Someone made a funny comment by saying, oh yeah, I've watched movies from the 70s. It makes sense that this would come from there. But, the fact that it has stood the test of time, and I think a lot of the theory coming from the left, it is constructed on top of this. Whether or not they've even read it, it requires this sort of, like I said, if you are into Marxist theory, you do end up here inevitably, and you can only take it even further. And I think Zizek, in one of his books that I'd read, in Continents of the Void, he does take it into a really interesting cosmic scale. But yeah, you can. The reason this is also seductive, like why do we read this? I think it's interesting. I want to understand why it stood the test of time. You know what I mean? Like, why does anyone know what Deleuzian means? Why is that relevant to political discourse? Maybe some people are using it incorrectly. That could be it. But there's something alive in this thing that has withstood the entropy of our culture. And so that's really why we're trying to take it seriously. And I do think, even if you disagree with it, you can see the parts that they're using. Like I had said, the idea of a desiring machine, it's interesting, but you can invert that. You can completely flip it on its head. And then it's a right wing, a dissident right sort of point. And you would only be able to flip it on its head if you have your first principles in place, and you've read enough other stuff that you can see that it's maybe not as well thought out as you might have been led to believe. Like, if you read it very carefully, like, oh, like, I don't think they know what they're talking about here, and they're just being a bit poetic. They're saying, oh, I'm just going to reference a song now I'm going to, so like, you can't write a book and mention solar anus so many times and still trick me into thinking that you know what the fuck you're talking about. I'm sorry, it's not going to happen. And that sounds very dismissive, but I dismiss. That's my prerogative. I'm allowed to wave my velvet gloved hand and say, this is fucking stupid. Not all of it, but it has to be, because again, the destination of something like this is the deconstruction of all of society, all of human endeavor. But like I said, with that same sleight of hand, we could say that this is just a gleaming endorsement and and glorification of fascism, which I'm sure was not intended, but you should have provided a better solution than being a trans schizophrenic. That doesn't work on everyone. It's not going to work on us.
Posted it again award.
Posted it again award. Oh, geez, the fucking chat's going wild. Now they're just talking about movies. This is why you can't bring up movies in these things, and maybe we have to have a hard rule on these in the future.
See, this is why you just need to make Movie Corner something you put on your Gumroad.
I think I'm going to start. That's the second time someone has said it, because I have seen a lot of movies recently. Do you want to know what Dimes thinks about Deadpool and Wolverine? You can pay me for it.
I
Let's
have
see.
learned that is the greatest pleasure of doing this online political shit is that turns out people really just want to talk about normal things that aren't like full of just lefty nonsense. And it's this, like, we talked about the eternal return earlier, and it's just like it's the eternal return to like the primordial like right winger online, which is like the return, the fall back to Gamergate. And that's why they probably let me write that stupid fucking article for The Blaze not too long ago.
Yeah, that was a good one. And are you happy with that one?
I'm happy with everything but the title.
I remember you were complaining about the title. What was it again?
DIY RPG FTW. And I was just like, I
Oh
just want to shoot
no.
myself, because the original title I had was Go Indie Young Man, because I was playing off the whole Go West and the Frontier being the title of the magazine. And instead I have like the most cringe ass title in that entire table of contents. But that's okay. We won't.
Your title was better.
I will return to Egg eventually.
I rebuke the editor that decided that. Like, you're not connecting with anyone by saying FTW. Even millennials spit at you for saying that. I don't know. Maybe I know the editor. Sorry. Sorry.
So we'll do this sometime in December, hopefully, before Christmas. And Gio will join us for part 2. And we'll really spend most of that episode focusing on Anti-Oedipus, but also everyone's favorite terms: territorialization, deterritorialization, and reterritorialization.
Yeah, we didn't even really get into Oedipus, and it only makes sense if you go through all the stuff that we had said. But that really sits firmly in the psychoanalytic section, I think. But
Yeah.
if you can believe it, guys, it's going to get trippier.
Oh, yeah. It will get trippier. I promise you.
Oh, let me just one comment from Vingel: go indie, but never go the Decemberists.
Sir, you were who put that comment up there? No, he needs to go. Vingel, you've lost your wrench. Fuck you. How dare you?
Oh, I'm sorry, Vingel. I didn't mean to cast the spotlight on you there. Also, Hazel says, solar anus sounds like something Soul Bra is trying to sell. I think he has literally advocated for that. He might even sell a course on how to do it. But that's the next step of this, was reading all this wild shit and building a grift off of it. Can I build a subscription service off of rhizomes, off of, what else? What can I say I'm going to attach my name to that doesn't sound reprehensible? Nothing really from this book. There's nothing I'd want to do in real life.
Well, there's that great band called Anal. You know how it goes. And you could do that. You could just call yourself Solar Anus, and you could just start a really passive-aggressive rock band.
Start a really, like, no effort whatsoever. Because I remember that band, Anal C. I remember as a teenager discovering them. I said, yeah, man, this is really fucked up. This is probably the most fucked up band in the world. And then as I get older, I realized, man, that was the gayest band that's ever existed. And Seth Putnam is just like a fat loser who died of a heroin overdose. Like, oh yeah, okay, this guy sucks. Everything about this band sucks. And then you listen to the music. Like I growing up, I was into really heavier music, into even the pig squealing vocals and shit. I'm like, this is bad. Although Seth Putnam did do one of the best musical projects ever, called Impaled Northern Moon Forest, which is just making fun of black metal bands. They just did like an acoustic black metal album that was spoofing. And I think about that name all the time: Impaled Northern Moon Forest.
It feels like a random name generator that your like Wiccan GF wants to name the baby that you've accidentally made with her.
And it's me going through news groups as an 18-year-old, like, Impaled Northern Moon Forest. Hell yeah. I bet this is about Satan. I bet this is about something fucked up. It's about a baby with horns.
Fabian Cartouche says they need to center desire and fulfillment because the benefits of adversity are their project's nemesis. That's a good comment, actually.
Where was that?
It's a little earlier in the stream. It's from my YouTube.
Oh yeah, Fabian Cartouche.
Chat.
They need to center desire and fulfillment because the benefits of adversity are left to their project's nemesis. Yeah. Also, geotrauma emergence. All right.
Yep, that'll happen next episode.
Yeah. Anyway, we'll leave. I gotta get going now because we're almost at 2 hours. So stay tuned for the next one. I had a really great time. Thank you for taking the time reading this with me. And it gets worse, everybody.
Yeah, it does actually get worse. So don't worry. We're going to have a great time with it. Thank you to all those that watched on YouTube. And thank you to the couple of, what was it right now? Like 700 some odd people who are watching on Twitter. Greatly appreciate it. These will be put on all of your favorite podcast platforms, both over at bloodsatellite.ca, but as well as for my own stuff, which you can find on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and the rest. I need to update the backlog, but that'll happen this week as well. Dimes, what do you have going on, man?
Actually, later this week, I'm going to be on the Decameron Film Festival, which I know you had appeared on previously.
Yes, I will actually. My appearance is going to be on December 7th.
I'm going to be this week, and I'm doing a film called You Won't Be Alone. So people can look that up. It's a really fascinating movie. Tomorrow night, I'm going to be on with Miranchuk Now, which is a great show that I love. And we'll be discussing, which is going to be a couple of Canadian guys talking shit. So it's kind of the opposite of this episode. We're just going to be having a good time. Bloodsatellite.ca is Prudentialist, very benevolently mentioned at the start. Check that for everything. And goodsuffer.ca, we're selling a limited run shirt, the felted Lindy Waffen LLC shirt. Very, very proud of it. So go and check that out. And where can we find you, Prude?
Oh, sure. You can just find me wherever that lovely amphibian profile picture you can find. I'm on Twitter, Substack, Telegram, all the rest. I will be, of course, with a new video out this Thursday. My good friend Ryan Turnipseed and I, we have about an hour and a half discussion diving into the history of what the term new right even means, the infighting between paleo-conservatives, Christian conservatives, libertarians, and neoconservatives throughout the 20th century. We build a lot off of Sam Francis and people like Murray Rothbard and their books about the betrayal of the American right and Beautiful Losers. So if you want to know what all of the history of that right-wing infighting means and what that means for the Trump administration coming into office next January, highly recommend you watch that video that comes out this Thursday. I will be live on the Decameron Film Festival with Frody Midjord on December 7th at 12 p.m. Eastern. I am covering the 1990 film Prayer of the Roller Boys, which I think is a film that perfectly encapsulates a lot of the cults of personality on the E-right for this day and age. And then on top of that, I have this great series here with Dimes. I highly recommend you check out our 3-part series on spinal catastrophism. Go subscribe to Blood Satellite. Go to bloodsatellite.ca. Enjoy the episodes. Become a patron on Gumroad. Real Secret Coffee Hours is my favorite thing to listen to because it's just an angry Canadian telling me how wrong everyone is. It's highly enjoyable. Well worth my money.
Thank you. It's the show where I always made a rule. I'm like, I don't want to bring drama and complaining about people to the main show, to Blood Satellite. So I made another show that just became me reading people's Substacks and saying what I don't like about it and them. And it's probably going to come back and haunt me in the future, but I'm having a blast.
It's a good time.
Prude's the one who endorsed me to keep doing it. Like
well, I pay it. So I pay for it, so I'd hope so.
And you're like, I love this. I'm like, I'm going to keep doing it just for you. If anything, if Prude's the only one paying for it, I'm still going to keep doing it. All right, so I think that's a good place to end. We will see you all next time. Thank you so much, everyone, for tuning. Everyone on X and YouTube, we've had a really great turnout for this one, especially for a Monday.